Hello, everyone. Jason Hagholm here. Today, I am joined by Andrew Bucholtz of Awful Announcing to talk about the latest news that came out about the shutdown of BloodyElbow.com in the MMA sphere. Andrew, first of all, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Jason. It's good to talk to you again.
Yes, it's nice to talk to you as well, Andrew. Well, Andrew, obviously, you work in the digital media space, and when you found out about this news about Bloody Elbow being sold to new owners, and then obviously the whole staff being let go and articles being deleted, what was your first take about this as you do work in this sphere as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly something that's not completely specific to Bloody Elbow. What we've seen a lot of turnover in the digital space. We've seen a lot of similar complaints to what Nate Wilcox, the founder of Bloody Elbow and former owner of it now, cited as his reasons for selling off the domain name and pivoting to Substack and podcasts. He specifically cited a lot of changes with Google's algorithm, difficulties in attracting ads, and so on. And that is a story that is across the industry. The other story that's across the industry is what new owner GRV Ventures is apparently trying to do with this, which is using a popular domain name with a history and putting different kinds of content out there and seeing how that does. But the Bloody Elbow situation does stand out in a few regards. One, for this being its second ownership transition in a year after SB Nation got rid of it and essentially sold it off to founder Nate Wilcox. And also for the deletion of a lot of the writers' archives.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing for me. It's one thing to purchase a brand like Bloody Elbow, but to get rid of all the content, especially where Bloody Elbow is a space where it was one of the rare, if not the only, investigative journalism sites in mixed martial arts. I think that's the thing that's brought up a lot of questions. Like, why would you buy something for the brand if you're just going to delete all the articles?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what has sparked, I think, maybe most of the outrage here is that a lot of very good, well-reported articles on very serious matters, including this antitrust case against the UFC from former fighters, a lot of that is now gone. Now, I mean, some of it has been preserved through our various internet archive sites and so on. But that's also a wider thing that we're seeing. We saw it with the Messenger in particular, where when they shut down, they turned off all their archives, at least to the public. We've seen other sites where after an ownership transition, a lot of, if not all of the articles have been deleted. But in this case, it does really stand out because of the particular nature of those articles. And like you say, the investigative journalism aspect of it.
Well, especially too, as Bloody Elbow, they have done probably the most in-depth journalism about this antitrust lawsuit, which is about to go to trial within about a month or so. And now this transition has happened to GRV Media, and all these articles are gone. Like, what are your takeaways on that? Because I think just the timing is just so interesting of this, Andrew.
Yeah, and so there have been a lot of people who have speculated on Twitter that maybe the UFC had something to do with this, maybe this has something specifically to do with the lawsuit. There's no evidence of that I've uncovered to date, and there are certainly reasons this could happen without that. In particular, there's a very good piece I linked in my piece on this by Scott Nover at Slate, talking about why a lot of companies are deleting archives. And in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily over liability concerns. It's not even over a threat of a lawsuit being filed, especially for stuff that is older than a few years. What the problem is really is that there are maintenance costs, not in just keeping those pages up, but in keeping them clean from buggy scripts and that sort of thing, junk ads, things that can cause viruses. And so a lot of companies have decided, well, we're just not going to do that. We're just not going to bother with that. But I thought that Scott proposed a really interesting solution there, is that it's very possible to make even a free copy of a site's entire archives, host that at absolutely minimal cost and without those liabilities. But that's not an approach we've seen widely accepted so far.
Yeah, I think that is, I guess, just the aspect of the media landscape we're at right now, and everyone's trying to get caught. And as well, like, what do you know about GRV, Andrew? It just seems like they have a lot of minimal sites, a lot of soccer kind of posts is what they own for websites like that, and it just seems like the transition is slowly off and running here, but it's definitely a different version of what we're getting from Bloody Elbow. And I don't know how that's going to take, because as we talked about, they do great investigative journalism, and the long form kind of writing is kind of falling away, not just in the MMA landscape, but in just the sports media landscape as a whole.
It definitely is. And yeah, it certainly sounds like, from everything GRV has said, I mean, they made vague comments about features and so on, but from what they've done so far, it's basic news pieces, basic sort of looks at what happens in a particular event and so on, things that you can find on a lot of other sites. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, and that does fit with what they seem to be doing with most of their sites, which, as you mentioned, are mostly soccer. They're a UK-based company. They run a lot of team-specific soccer sites. In some ways, it's interesting that they have now picked this up, because there's some similarities between them and SB Nation, who used to own Bloody Elbow and got out of that business a year ago as part of their larger divesting of a lot of team sites. But rather than the real sort of heavy community focus that a lot of the SB Nation stuff had, these sites are much more just news stuff, transfer reports, that sort of thing. We don't entirely know what their long-term plans for MMA coverage are, or what they're doing with Bloody Elbow. It is interesting to me. They're cranking out a lot of articles. They're mostly from a couple of writers. And it's interesting to me that the one guy here, Tom Loyan, who's heading this up, he really doesn't seem to have much of a social media presence at all, which is interesting in this day and age.
That was going to be my next question. It's like the man in charge, who apparently has such a social media platform, per what his bio on the GRV website says, or even his LinkedIn as well, has no social media presence and seems to be, for all we know, a fake writer, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have any proof he's a fake writer. He does have a LinkedIn with a work history. He does. I ran a couple of his pieces through an AI checker, and it came out with them being human written. So I can't accuse him of being fake. I do think it is quite interesting that he's somebody who, in his bio, is saying he's engaging with all these fighters and following all these people on Twitter, and then his link Twitter doesn't actually do that, but perhaps he does that under another account that doesn't have his name on it or something. But it is interesting in general, I think, and this goes back to what you were talking about with features and longer form and investigative things. I think in the digital space, we're seeing a real shift away from the writer mattering and to an idea, at least from the owners of these companies, that only the company matters, only the name of the company matters, and who you get to produce content there, and even the quality of the content they produce isn't the most important part. And even to the point of, like, these don't have to be figures known within the space. They don't have to be figures who are known by fans. And some of that is about a shift in where you make your money too, because a lot of it is targeting not super informed readers who follow personalities or sites they like on Twitter and are clicking on things that way. A lot of it is targeting just a general search audience. And so if you don't really care about who the readers are, then you don't really care so much about who's writing the content.
And I think with that mindset, if you don't care who the readers are, but it's like with the people that were reading Bloody Elbow, they were the diehard fans, the people that really care about, the growth and actual journalism with the sport. Because I don't know if you pay attention from afar, but it's like there is not much journalism in the sport. And I think that's just the biggest blow, as we've kind of talked about, with no more Bloody Elbow and this transition to this new media where it just seems more like some puff pieces and any blog site or any media site that's out there right now.
Yeah, and I think this is especially interesting with it happening in MMA because yes, we have covered and I have covered many of the MMA media controversies over the years, and they're interesting and happened in a number of ways that are different from a lot of the ball and stick sports. In one thing, MMA is a newer organization, so that there have been a few things going on there. It took quite a while for an organized journalists association, and that was in response to some very particular bans from Dana White of the UFC. Uh, Dana White is an interesting element of all this too, because he is much more confrontational with media and much more. He seems to want to influence what coverage media who attend his events provide a lot more than you might get from an individual commissioner in another sport. And he also seems to be less worried about criticism for that. Whereas, like, recently even we wrote a thing about David Sampson, the former Marlins executive who now works for Meadowlark, and his comments on MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred's backlash to a Dan Le Batard interview. Well, after that, MLB wanted very much to make it clear that they don't think Manfred did that, at least in the way that Sampson was portraying it. And so, those sides can argue about that all they want, but it's interesting to me that there's at least that perception there of they do not want to be perceived in acting that way, whereas Dana White very much does. Dana White has no qualms about this and is very happy to say a lot of it right on camera. And so I think that makes the Bloody Elbow story particularly interesting, and considering that it's never been just one thing either, right? Like there were particular feuds with Ariel Helwani and so on, but recently there's been all this stuff around the pressers and the questions to fighters there around Dana White. Do you put a leash on your guys? And Dana White's response to that, like, it's not one specific controversy in MMA. There are a lot of media controversies, and that's before you get into things like fighter pay, antitrust lawsuits, and all of that. So it's a sport with a lot of very serious issues, and definitely not a lot of people really looking into it that way.
It's a sport for sure with those issues, and it's one where, the UFC and Dana White, they do a good job, I guess, putting the wool over a lot of people's eyes, whether they're fans of the sport because they just really care about, I got to get to my Saturday to watch the events, or just the normal journalists who don't really, care about this sport because they still have the archaic look for it. But it's kind of also interesting how the UFC and the media transit for MMA, they're transitioning more from, a journalist, someone day to day, like the staff that just got let go from Bloody Elbow, to just, influencers or social media presence. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons why this story is so impactful, because you're laying it in the hands of people that, obviously have some sort of bias when they're putting some content out there. And it's just that's just it. It's just more content. Granted, the content on Bloody Elbow is content, but there's clearly, a journalism touch to it. This is just kind of just fun videos out there, and that's what we're going to have to rely on, as like information for the sport.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some truth to that. I think one thing that will be worth watching with this is that Bloody Elbow, at least Nate Wilcox, who founded it, sold it, and is now running the Substack. He's talked about trying to keep a lot of their contributors involved, trying to do stuff there on a subscription basis. I don't know how extensive that's going to be, but I think there is real merit to that idea, especially for in-depth pieces of interest to particular people that you cannot easily find anywhere else. And we're seeing a lot of journalists who are finding great success with platforms like Substack or other newsletter subscription sites. So I think it's not necessarily that there is no audience for this. We'll see how it specifically works in their case, but I think it is unfortunate that a free general audience site appears to be going away from that model.
Do you feel that's kind of the way this model's going to be going now, Andrew, where it's basically, if you want information for really not just MMA, but any sport, that it's going to have to be, you have to put, fork out some money for it?
I think that's true in some respects and not true in other respects. I think if there are going to be a lot of individual writers, and particularly those who have individual brands, who are going to find more success with a subscription model. I think there will still be a market, hopefully, for free-to-read sites that are supported by advertising, whether that's general display advertising, podcast advertising, all sorts of those things. I hope there is still a plan for that, especially as I work for a site that operates on that. But I think there is a way for those things to work. I think you can still do good work under that kind of model. It just it comes with a lot of different challenges, really. In addition to deep dives in journalism, you have to also write things that will get general audience, wide audience regard. You have to build up a sufficient audience that will really love your content and follow along with your content and actively read those deep dives, because there's no point doing them if nobody's going to read them. And a lot of those things are not the things that get stumbled across by general traffic. So I think there's still definitely potential for all of those things, but it's certainly harder than it used to be. And there are certainly less sites making it work than there used to be.
And I guess really lastly here, Andrew, as this story did just break on Tuesday, what do you think the long run here is with Bloody Elbow? I know they have planned, as you said, they've retained the rights to their Substack, YouTube, and some podcasts. But what do you think the landscape here is for Bloody Elbow in the MMA space going forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I think their Substack certainly has some appeal and has some potential. I think a lot of its success is going to be determined not just by it being Nate Wilcox's Substack, but if he can get a lot of the other writers who were really prominent there, if he can get them to contribute regularly, if they can make enough money for him to hire them to contribute regularly. I think that all has potential. Their podcasts obviously have potential, and there's great merit to podcasts, particularly from an advertising standpoint. In many regards, it can be easier to sell good podcast ads and digital display advertising, and sometimes that market fluctuates a little less. So I think there's certainly some potential for the things that they've built, and I think there's also potential for people who were writing there and did really well there to find other spots in the MMA landscape, whether that's working for themselves or working for other companies that are going to take this seriously and cover it seriously. But at the same time, though, I mean, one prominent spot for that just went away. So that leaves less of them. It doesn't feel like anything is going to specifically pop up to replace it. And so I think generally we're going to see a little bit of a drop off, certainly in the volume of this kind of coverage that's being produced.
Yes, and as we talked about as well, especially with the precipice of this antitrust lawsuit, which is about to begin in a month. So it'll be interesting to see how that coverage is done. I know there's some great writers still out there and using their social media to put out the content and coverage of such events of that antitrust lawsuit and everything like that. But yeah, the landscape definitely has changed, and it's really, Andrew, I think the best way to say it, it's for the worse for MMA with the loss of Bloody Elbow.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I think Bloody Elbow, in the form it had under SB Nation, and then also this last year as an independent site, was a great site and was a valuable resource. It was a place that had a significant fan base, and it was a place for a lot of very good writers to publish their work. And I think it's very sad that that's gone away. And it's also very sad that a lot of that great work has disappeared, at least in an easily accessible fashion. That's unfortunate, and that's a loss for those who love MMA.
It's a loss for those who love MMA. It's just a loss for everything that's gone on in this wacky sport that is called mixed martial arts that's not easily accessible anymore. But Andrew, before I let you go, plug yourself out here where people can find your work, as you do great work for many different platforms. And of course, as you see right there at awfulannouncing.com.
Yeah, thank you. So my main role is as a staff writer and editor for Awful Announcing. You can find us at awfulannouncing.com. We cover everything sports media and sports business. A lot of my focus is on sort of the more sports business angles, but we've got coverage of just about everything. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew Bucholtz, and I do some general sports writing for our Associated General Sports site, which is The Comeback.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, a pleasure to chat with you. Hopefully it won't be almost like 10 years since the last time we speak again. Thanks for coming on, and it was a real pleasure to chat with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Have a good one.